So you've seen the master plan that Jan Peter has organized. You have the innovation part and the governance part. And the plan of this project is to try to bring both of them in different kinds of ways, which I think is an extremely stimulating intellectual exercise. So I come from the governance side, both on sociology and political science, and I'm getting interested in some of these issues more by looking at public policies and urban governance, and doing more and more work with people more like you, I understand, doing work on environment, on risk, at my institute at Sciences Po. So in the group that we have at Sciences Po in Paris, we have lots of people now working a lot on these issues of risk environment, from Bruno Latour, who's joined us, to a younger scholar on risk and environment. So in a way, we're going on the same travel, the same journey that you're having, and Peter, slowly, of course. But what we tend to do in a way in our research project is a little bit different, because one of our concerns is to really understand how you govern societies, and how ways of influencing, giving a direction, giving a sense to societies is changing over time. So we try to link a lot these issues of governance and instruments and innovations to elements of restructuring of political authority and the state and the capacity of the state to govern authorities. And by doing that, we do lots of work, including on the stranger case in Europe, which is the case of Britain. So I'll give the things afterwards, but there's a list of papers which I will use for this talk, both coming from the work we've done on urban governance, the work on policy instruments, on the EU, or on the way to govern Britain. So there are various papers. So my talk will be a mix of all these things. So that's an excuse for not being clear. There are papers behind that. And I will do two things, really. Number one, I will come back on some of the current issues or current discussion on governance, and to show how the questions of instruments is becoming more and more central in the governance literature and why it is the case. And then I will develop some points on the analysis of policy instruments. I will be quite short on the analytical framework, because I will give you some example of the way we have been thinking about innovation. In a way, we are skeptics on innovation. So we tend to say innovation is a very important subject. So it should not be done by looking only at innovation. So let's pretend innovation is not so important and look at the limits of how we can measure to really identify serious innovation. It's the strategy we use in a systematic way in research, which is when we study government, we try to show the limits of government to understand what is really governed. So I will do the same thing for innovation. I will show you the methodology we've used in a current research project we're just doing at the moment. Okay. Number one, just come back on this question of governance. As you know, there's a huge literature, you're familiar with that. I will not come back to that. But I think what is interesting is that the questions about governance are evolving. And what we see at the moment is not just classic questions of who governs, but as we know, how governments and how various governance processes are operating. In a way, there's a sort of Foucauldian turn in governance studies when we try to think very much about governmental activities. And we know the influence of the Nicholas Rose and Peter Miller project when they work on governmentality. And as you know, they did it in a very strange way when you are a strict scholar of Foucault, which is fine because you need to be very creative when you use Foucault. And my colleagues who are serious Foucauldian always tell me, don't worry, with a recent text which have just come out that nobody had read before, we are very clear there are at least 3 different ways and definitions of governmentality in Foucault's work. So yes, let's be creative and don't worry about orthodox of Foucault. The point really I want to emphasize is that we know that workers work, governments governed, but the question we're asking nowadays is what is really governed? Because in all sorts of ways, sometimes the governance literature has taken for granted some of the government illusion, which is we look at how governance operates and we don't look at the limits of what is really done. And in many ways, beyond the classic questions, we try to analyze through various ways. I do that by looking at both countries or cities. We try to understand, do governments really always govern? What do they govern really? How they do that? And more importantly, what is not governed? And I think that's one of the important points of sociology, is really to think that lots of sectors in society are not governed at all by political regulations, and that the politics have very, very strong limit. So can we identify these functions of government over time? Which group are escaping from governments? Who governs when governments do not govern? And when governance is a sort of weak word to say we are lost and we use the governance literature. Can governance replace government? Not often. We have governance failure as much as government failures, as Jessop has pointed out at a very early stage. So, all these things of how to govern complex societies is really the core, I think, of this governance literature. And I think it's getting more interesting to look at all these limits rather than keeping the classic questions of who governs, rather than what are the limits of governments and how does it work and what is not governed. One way, of course, is to come back to classic authors like James Scott in his famous book on Seeing Like a State, saying, well, when you want to understand anything about government, and he's also taken from Weber and Foucault, you have to understand these technologies of government, and you have to think out, all these things which make society legible. And I think it's this idea of making society legible, which has been very important and influential in social science, remains very strong when we think about policy instruments, innovation, when we think about governance. How do you make complex society legible? And I will not insist on societies are complex, people are moving around. I like the anecdote when they did the last census in the UK, you may know that they lost 900,000 people, didn't know where they were. So how do you govern a population when you just don't know where they were? And you have all these pensioners and students and all these people traveling around, spending time in Tuscany and all that. How do you govern people who are mobile? This sort of civil, how do you make society legible to be able to tax them and to govern them? I think that's the questions which are interesting beyond the classic idea of continuity. In other words, governments govern, but not everything, not every sector, not all the time. And you have change over time of density of government and governance mechanism. And I think when you think about policy instruments and innovations, it's very strongly related to that. Some sectors are governed with lots of public policies, but some are not. As we know, financial markets are not always very strongly governed, as we discovered. And we also know that we have lots of choice and networks and technical systems playing a role in governance, but we don't know if they govern or if they regulate. And there's a lot of ambiguity. And a lot of instruments, innovations is coming from this ambiguity on regulation and governance that we have to explore in a more systematic way. So my argument really is to argue that one of the reasons why we tend to argue policy instruments are important to understand governance and public policy change, generally speaking, is, of course, it is one bit. I mean, there are lots of important things in governance and public policy, not just policy instrument. I'm not attempting to create a school of policy instruments. I mean, we don't care about that. But what we discovered in public policy analysis and in governance analysis is that a lot of the discourse, a lot of the rhetorics, a lot of the goals of policies are becoming incredibly vague and general. There are many, many analyses of public policy where when you study what are the ideas, what are the goals, what are the objectives of the policy, you see vague general goals. So many policies start by, we want to promote growth, equality, sustainable development, and to save the world, basically, okay? And when you do some specific study of the goals in many policy, there's one research we did on urban policy, we found 23 goals, most of them being contradictory, of course. And we also know from public policy literature that a lot of the policies are developed in order to avoid blame avoidance strategies, as Kent Weaver and Chris Wood have analyzed. So if you study, for instance, in the UK, the regulation about food and all the development of a food regulation framework to avoid the famous crisis, remember the mad cow crisis? Well, it's a wonderful piece of regulation to govern. Well, not to govern precisely. It's a wonderful piece of regulation to make sure that next time nobody can blame the minister, okay? But it doesn't change anything or very little on real output and what is really done. So with some of our colleagues in my center, we have lots of debate on that, do ideas matter or not? And of course they matter, but we tend to argue that in many public policies, you have to concentrate on the implementation and in particular on the instrumentation.